So I want to first thank the former CRISM Quebec Atlantic node for funding this research. It actually ended up being 2 different projects, and in the amount of time I have, I can only present one and probably not even get through that. So I'm going to do my best, but I've picked this one. It's the more recent one that we've done. I'll also say that we brought together a group of researchers and people with lived and living experience included in that group of researchers that had experience in sex and gender in relation to substance use, and also in relationship issues in relation to substance use and substance-related problems. So it was kind of a multidisciplinary group. So it was actually a really fun project to work on. So in terms of what we knew when we came into this research, there's a lot of conflicting research on whether men or women drink more in response to relationship conflict. And one of the things that we thought about is, well, maybe both are related, but they're related through slightly different pathways. So we know that conflict can be a trigger for substance use, and that maybe the emotions that people experience in response to conflict, they're kind of different pathways for people who identify as women and men. Then we thought about it, do we really want to be looking at how people identify, or do we want to take a look at gender roles and their relationship? So just a little bit of background in this research. So we know that men and those who conform to more masculine norms drink more. Drinking among women and feminine people is concerning nonetheless because of convergence and telescoping. So convergence means that research is suggesting that women are drinking more and getting closer to reaching the levels of drinking in men. And telescoping just means that the time from when a woman starts drinking to when she would develop problems is shorter. That's that idea of telescoping. In terms of romantic conflicts, what I'm talking about here is a natural occurrence in close relationships, and they tend to elicit a myriad of emotions. You think about negative emotions in response to conflict, but there can also be positive emotions that are elicited at least following a conflict. And negative emotions, there's quite a bit of research to suggest that negative emotions tend to elicit behavioral responses to minimize them, like drinking behavior, more so than positive emotions. But positive emotions nonetheless are associated with drinking, often more social drinking, right? Drinking in social contexts. Now, drinking in response to conflict, as I mentioned, there's this mixed evidence regarding sex and gender differences in drinking in response to romantic conflict, and we thought maybe we could try to contribute to understanding that mixed data. So what we thought about is masculinity and femininity both influencing the emotions that people would experience after a romantic conflict or during a romantic conflict, and that those emotions in turn might contribute to drinking behavior. And our drinking behavior, we conceptualize both in terms of did you or didn't you drink, as well as if you drank, how much did you drink? So we used Qualtrics panel surveys to recruit participants to get a large enough sample to do this kind of work. We measured gender role orientation a little differently. In the past, the BEM sex role inventory is the big thing that people use, but it's very outdated and it's very, it's just not consistent with gender roles today. The measure that we used is the one that's freely available, and it's been developed not by theory of what femininity is and masculinity is. Rather, they took a very large sample of people, divided them into whether they identified as women or men, and I do recognize that's not the full spectrum of gender. That's a limitation of this work. But they took items that reflected the biggest differences between the interests and behaviors of people who identified as men and women to define what femininity and masculinity is. So sometimes there's odd things that come up. Like one of the items, for example, that defines femininity is like interest in reading a horoscope, right? Like you wouldn't think, but that's a big difference between people who identify as women and people who identify as men. So it's based more on like evidence-based rather than theory-based definitions of femininity and masculinity. And then what we did for the conflict is we wanted to have people think about like a situation where they'd had a romantic conflict to help them like remember accurately their emotions and their behavior. So we asked them to think back to the last significant romantic conflict that you had and describe that conflict, and then tell us the different emotions that you experienced during and immediately after that conflict, and then tell us about their drinking behavior. Did you drink or didn't you drink? And if you drank, how much did you drink? So first thing that we found out is that 35% of the people in our sample reported drinking after their significant relationship disagreement. So this meant we had to use specific kinds of statistics where we had to separate out predicting did they or didn't they drink, and then if they drank, how much did they drink. And this is, so I'm going to show you a lot of things here, but all of our analyses include this zero inflated portion of the model. That means it says predicting excess zero, so that means predicting if you didn't drink. So we're going to reverse that because our interest is, are you interested, did you drink or didn't you? And then the counts portion of the model, how much did you drink? So what we can see here is maybe I'll just go back for a second and say, in our analyses, we include masculinity and femininity, but we also control for biological sex, okay? Because there are differences, for example, in body weight that might contribute to, and water composition that might contribute to how much somebody drinks. So we wanted to control for that. So the first thing to see here is that we actually got masculinity was the only variable that's coming out, and it's predicting whether somebody drinks or not. So more masculine people were more likely to drink following a conflict. That was our only significant finding in that model. That's before you start to think about emotions that people are experiencing. This is just the simple prediction of sex, masculinity, and femininity. Now, the next thing we did is we wanted to take a look. We put together the emotions about disagreement scale by discussing over and over what were the different emotions that people might experience, consulting the literature, and we put together a whole bunch of things that we thought people might experience following a conflict with their partner. And we first did a factor analysis. That's just to see like how are the items hanging together. And we found a negative affect and a positive affect. We also took a look, we wanted to look at overall negative affect, overall positive affect, as well as all the different specific emotions that people experienced. What you can see here is that masculinity related to almost all negative emotional responses to conflict, and femininity to a subset of negative emotions following conflict. And then we found that femininity related to almost all positive emotional responses to conflict, but not masculinity. Then we looked at what emotions might be related to drinking behavior, just that part of the model. And we found out that overall negative emotions, as well as all the individual emotions were related to drinking following the conflict. Then fewer positive emotions, but some positive emotions were related. So relieved and validated were related to drinking post-conflict. And then we had some emotions, surprised and superior, that were both positive and negative, had bits of both positive and negative, and they were related to drinking post-conflict. Now, these are really complicated looking models. I'm going to put them into pictures in a minute, but I just kind of want to show you overall. You can see here that both masculinity and femininity were associated with, so this is what emotions explain the relationship between masculinity or femininity and drinking after conflict. And so for both masculinity and femininity, we see overall negative emotions mattering. And for masculinity, it's all the negative emotions. And for femininity, it's some of them. So let's go through and see which ones. So masculinity uniquely, not femininity, uniquely was associated with drinking through some sad emotions, sad, lonely, disappointed, also disgusted and angry, and feeling unheard and powerless. So we have post hoc explanations. We don't know why that is, but one thing we were thinking of in terms of the sad emotions is that when people don't seek social support, they can experience more, we know that, can experience more depressed emotions. And so we believe masculinity, there's evidence to suggest more masculine people are less likely to seek social support. In terms of angry, we weren't surprised about that, so masculinity and aggression, that's not surprising. But unheard and powerless, again, we were a bit surprised, but men wanting to, masculinity being associated with greater need to be in control, that if a relationship conflict results in them feeling not in control, that unheard and powerlessness might lead them to drinking. With masculinity and femininity, we see the self-conscious emotions, the fear responses, and jealousy all mattering. And then positive emotions explain some relationships between gender roles and drinking following conflict. So specifically, feeling relieved and validated and overall positive emotions mattered for femininity only. And so I've just shown that there. So femininity related to greater, feeling relieved and validated following a conflict and related to drinking behavior. So some of the key findings to just summarize here. So gender seems to matter more than sex. You might have seen that coming out, like, you know, we're controlling for biological sex and that's not predicting drinking, so it was more masculinity. In terms of emotions predicting drinking following a conflict, so negative emotions seem to matter more overall before you start considering femininity and masculinity. And then there are these quite interesting gender role differences in which emotions mediate that relationship between conflict and drinking behavior, which could be very useful therapeutically. So in terms of the implications of this work, they do contribute to relationship theory by providing a more nuanced understanding of how masculinity and femininity relate to specific emotions and to drinking following conflict. They contribute to sex and gender theory by really highlighting, I think there's more and more research coming out that's really highlighting we can't just look at biological sex, right? We need to go beyond that. And then I think for, you know, in terms of therapeutic implications, it's identifying therapeutic targets that you would want to work with in people that are more masculine or more feminine, in terms of helping prevent them from engaging in excessive drinking following conflict, or if they're trying to reduce their drinking or stop drinking, which things would you want to focus on in therapy to prevent alcohol relapse. And I want to just acknowledge the funding from CRISM, Qualtrics for collaborating on the data collection, and then also the open source psychometrics project where we drew our measure of gender roles. They're still making a mistake in calling it sex roles. It's gender roles. Okay, I'll open it up for questions now.
Hi, sorry. Thank you, Sherry. We have time for questions. I'll run back here. It's good. It's good. Step. All right. No, it's great.
I'm inconvenient.
Hi, Sherry. Thank you very much. Great presentation. I just have a quick question about sort of distilling through all of the various numbers. So you had a lot of different variables and a lot of different results. And as I was looking through it, I was sort of thinking, some of the effects are bigger, some of them are smaller, some of them are sort of quite small, hovering around significance. And as part of your work, I'm curious, have you taken a look of what would happen if multiple test adjustment was corrected?
Sorry,
right?
we did do that.
Yeah.
So I highlighted in dark. So we have the stars. I should have said that. The stars represent traditional statistical significance, and then the ones that I highlighted were the ones that withstood a multiple testing correction. We didn't do that in the final steps, and anyway, I could talk to you about this because I would like your advice on it. We were trying to figure out how to do that in that final regression piece. Like, do you control for the total number of tests that you've done?
Right,
There's different issues. And so, like, the consistency in the story is a little difficult too, because you've got like different tests of the different steps in the model, right? And you want to have a consistent story because something can't be a mediator if it's not even significant in the earlier steps, right? So. Yeah.
Right. No, that's helpful. It sounds like basically some of the things you highlighted is the distilled story so far.
It's the distilled
and that's what I was
story.
curious about.
It is. And what we're trying to do too is like make sense of all these, these labels of emotions and try to put them together into a story. So for example, guilt and shame coming out together, we know those are self-conscious emotions. And then there's some that are more anxious emotions. But it's not always easy. They don't always fit exactly how you might conceptualize them.
All right, thank you. Okay, one more question quickly here. I'll run.
Thank you very much, Sherry. You explained this, but I missed that. So can you clarify how did you measure the masculinity versus, I just want to know if there was a range of it or it was like two, because I think you use logistic regression, so probably just.
Yeah, so it is a continuous measure. And so what they did to develop the scale is they gave a very large number of items to a very large sample, and then they factor analyzed them and reduced to the one, so they found a two-factor solution, and they took the items that showed the strongest difference between people who identified as women and people who identified as men, regardless of theory, like not around theory at all, just which were making significant contributions to distinguishing somebody that identifies as woman versus man. And then, so they distilled it to a smaller number of items, and then you complete that measure, and like the BEM, you add it up, and so everybody's on a range, like you could be very masculine and very feminine, or you could be very feminine and not masculine at all, right? Like, so there are two continua that people can score on independently.
Okay, I'm sorry, we can hold the question off till the lunch break. We need to move on to the next speaker. So thank you, Sherry.
Okay, thanks.